What's going on, everybody? In this YouTube video, I'm going to be telling you an interesting fact about each president. Some presidents I added more than one fact, and some presidents, well, you'll see. Starting off with our boy George Washington. Technically, he started World War I by firing on a French fort while leading a British army. Now, this started what is known as the French and Indian War in the Americas, and in Europe is known as the Seven Years' War. He fired on Fort Ticonderoga, and this was technically a world war because it was fought on two separate continents, and it was fought by the French with Native Americans and the English with Native Americans, which was a conglomerate. Both armies were a conglomerate of different nations and different kinds of people, so it technically was a world war. John Adams, longest living president until Ronald Reagan. He lived to be 90 years old. Thomas Jefferson, he was the first quote-unquote celebrity president because he would walk around the street and everyone would know him. People knew him before his presidency, and he'd have great influence leading up to his presidency and after. He created a popular catchphrase, which is, "My name is Haynes," which was often said when you embarrassed yourself. So say you tripped when you walked into a door, and you would say, "My name is Haynes," or whatever, because some guy came up to Thomas Jefferson and said something that was embarrassing to him or whatever, and Thomas Jefferson was like, "What's your name?" And the guy said, "My name is Haynes." And when he told the story, it caught on and it became a funny term that you say when you're embarrassed. James Madison, he wrote George Washington's first speech, and he was arrested with Thomas Jefferson for riding a carriage on a Sunday. Him and Thomas Jefferson were both arrested together. That's funny. James Monroe, he was sent by Washington to spy on troops in Trenton during the crossing of the Delaware. He's actually in the famous picture. And he studied a law apprenticing job under Thomas Jefferson. John Quincy Adams, he was an incredible diplomat. People overlook how strong his foreign policy was. He studied in Paris and he studied in the Netherlands before his presidency. He's also the first president to be photographed, even though this picture was taken after his presidency. Andrew Jackson, I have a lot of facts about this guy. He's the only person to ever be featured on Confederate currency and USD. He's also the first president to survive an assassination attempt. And this assassination attempt, by the way, was divine intervention because the odds were 1 in 125,000 that he died. Both pistols were in working condition and both pistols misfired. He was a prisoner of war, um, and after he refused to polish a British officer's boots, he was cut in the face and in the hand with a sword. And he was imprisoned with his brother, who later died from his injuries, but he was a prisoner of war. Also, Andrew Jackson had the world's biggest block of cheese at the time. It was 1,400 pounds, and he would invite random guests from all over Washington, D.C. You could literally walk into the White House and help him eat it, and apparently bits of cheese would get stuck in the carpet and would reek the White House for years. People said that it lasted between 3 and 4 years. The White House just smelled like rotten cheese. I literally cannot make this up. This is the craziest fact to me. Martin Van Buren. He met Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton in his father's tavern when he was a child. Martin Van Buren's also the only president to not be linked with the other presidents, genetically speaking. He is, I believe, Dutch, and he never spoke English until he was like 10. But yeah, meeting Aaron Burr and Hamilton in the same tavern when he was a kid is pretty interesting. William Henry Harrison, he was the son of a Virginia governor and then later became the governor of the Indiana Territory. And he had the first like genuine presidential campaign. And there was a famous song, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, that was like his running campaign. But he was the first president to like technically go on a campaign. John Tyler, he set the vice president precedent, which is when the president dies, when William Henry Harrison died, John Tyler, he was not supposed to be president. Vice president just meant basically an assistant to the president. It never meant that you would secede into the presidency if something were to happen to the president. And so he was nicknamed His Accidency. He also died a traitor because when the Civil War broke out, he took the Confederate side and moved to the South. And people would come up and talk to him, and he'd yell at them and tell them to get away after his presidency, which is just, it's super sad. James K. Polk, he was excruciatingly boring. Do you know how hard it was to find a fact about this guy? Technically, he bought the Oregon Territory, but it was already a territory before him. It was just official under him, which finally, I guess, connected the Atlantic to the Pacific, fulfilling Manifest Destiny, if you want to call it that. Oregon didn't become a state until later on, but he did secure the territory and fulfilled Manifest Destiny. He's an extremely boring guy. Zachary Taylor, like Napoleon, Zachary Taylor would live amongst his soldiers despite being a general. It was said that he would live and eat the same food and be stuck in the mud and be all in the crappy conditions with his troops. Funny enough, he was exhumed in 1991, and you can find a picture of his skull online, by the way. He was exhumed in 1991 because people thought that he was poisoned to death. People thought that, I think it was the cherries in his ice cream or something like that, was poisoned, and that later killed him, which it was found out that that was actually just a myth. But yeah, we didn't know until 1991. Millard Fillmore founded the University of Buffalo. At the time, it was the biggest university in New York. Franklin Pierce, his mom was Anna Kendrick. Just kidding. Franklin Pierce had to walk 12 miles in a thunderstorm as a punishment for skipping church, which he later credited as life-changing. He skipped church, and his father drove him 12 miles away from his house, and then, because he said he was, like, going to take him into town, dropped him off, turned around, and then told him to walk back. And that was, like, that punishment was enough for him to change his life. And this is true, by the way. His mom was Anna Kendrick. It was just not the Anna Kendrick you're thinking of, obviously. James Buchanan was an incredible diplomat. He was a minister to Russia. He could speak many languages. He was a minister to Great Britain. And he's the guy who won James K. Polk the Oregon Territory. It was under Polk's administration, but James Buchanan was really the guy behind it. And he looks like the evil bird from Rio, by the way. I don't know, to me, he does. Abraham Lincoln was the first president to be photographed at his inaugural address, and he was a poet. You can actually read his poems online. Here he is giving his inaugural address, obviously taller than everyone else. And some people say that Jefferson Davis was in this picture somewhere. This is a zoomed-in picture, but Jefferson Davis would be like down here. And that Lee Harvey Oswald was also in this picture. Andrew Johnson escaped from indentured servitude, and he lived an extremely horrible life. People often rank this guy as one of the worst presidents. Guys, he had one of the worst lives ever. When he was born into poverty. He was sold into indentured servitude by his mother. His brother died. He ran away. People were looking for him. People put posters up offering rewards for Andrew Johnson, and they ended up never finding him. And to work his way up into a high office, I mean, I know that Abraham Lincoln gave him basically a handout because he's from the South to be his vice president. But guys, he lived a horrible, horrible life. History absolutely takes a dump on this guy, but he was really trying his hardest. I mean, he really was trying his hardest. Ulysses S. Grant. He was betrayed and taken advantage of by literally almost everybody in his whole life. Not just his political career, not just his presidential career, not just his career as a general, but his whole life. He was a very naive person. Despite him being a war hero, a president, and later on a celebrity, people still took advantage of this guy and went behind his back, and it was a messy life. He was a very naive person, but he was a really good person. He wrote memoirs which basically saved his family's life after he died. Rutherford B. Hayes. He won one of the most narrow elections in the history of the world, not just the United States. It was such a close call. It was one of the closest elections of all time. And he was one of the smartest people to ever hold office. People don't really look at this guy. People kind of forget about him, but he was a genius. James A. Garfield, another genius. He could write in one hand in Latin and in Greek in the other. And he was a very strong and bold speaker. I think his father was a preacher, and he got like kind of the preacher tone and preacher cadence from his father. But he was a very, very good speaker. Chester A. Arthur. A lot of people thought he was Canadian because his mother was Canadian and his mother lived in Canada at the time he was born. So people kind of used that against him in his political career. They would call him a Canadian man, that he's not a true American. And he had over 80 pairs of pants and got the nickname the Dude President because he was a very fashionable guy. Grover Cleveland was the mayor of Buffalo, governor of New York, and then president. Then after that was on the board of trustees for Princeton. He has quite the resume. Benjamin Harrison campaigned from his home where crowds would gather outside. People would come out to his house and he would just campaigned them. William McKinley was the first clean-shaven president since Andrew Johnson. And he taught in a one-classroom school. This is another very boring president, by the way. Theodore Roosevelt, my favorite historical fact of all time. Can you guess what it is? That's Theodore Roosevelt with his younger brother watching, can you guess what? The funeral of Abraham Lincoln. That's right. This is a real photograph, and this is my all-time favorite history fact of all time ever of all time. This is the best fact ever. That Teddy Roosevelt was photographed watching Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession. That is crazy stuff. He was literally the most interesting person of all time. I mean, like, you could write thousands of books about this guy and still be missing details and still be missing wonderful stories. This guy is the most interesting person of all time, dude. You should go, like, try and get as much information about him as possible because you'll be mind blown how there's not more movies about this guy. William Howard Taft was the heavyweight wrestling champion at Yale. Screw this. Whoa! Wilson. Warren G. Harding named his genitals Jerry, and we know this because of a letter he wrote to his mistress. Calvin Coolidge, someone once said to him, "I didn't vote for you," and he replied, "Well, someone did." And every morning he'd ask his assistant, "Is the country still there?" after he woke up from a nap, which is kind of weird. Like, his assistant would be like, "Hey, how are you?" And he'd be like, "Is the country still there?" I don't know. Man of very important and interesting words. And everyone knows the 2-word story where his assistant bet him, "I bet you can't say 3 words this whole dinner," and he goes, "You lose," and she lost. Herbert Hoover is in the Mining Hall of Fame. And he's very overlooked by history because he's like sandwiched between FDR and Calvin Coolidge, like 2 pretty nice, good, decent presidents. And yeah, he's the only one born in Iowa, which is kind of unfortunate because I was born in Iowa, so he gets a bad rap. Franklin D. Roosevelt, 14-year-old Fidel Castro asked Franklin D. Roosevelt for a $10 bill. I don't think FDR ever responded to him, but Fidel Castro, you can pull up what he said in the letter, and it's pretty interesting. Also, people think that the D in Roosevelt or the D in FDR stands for Delano. No, it's Delano. Delano. There's no R at the end. Harry S. Truman. 2 Puerto Rican assassins tried to kill him in a hotel while the White House was being renovated. One of his guards was killed, and Truman heard the whole thing, and it was very, very sad. Dwight D. Eisenhower made over 200 paintings. He's also the reason we have highways. Very, very good person. Nice interstate systems. Very overlooked. People don't give this guy enough credit. John F. Kennedy ordered thousands of Cuban cigars before imposing an embargo on Cuba. In classic president fashion, you get it while it's good, and then you impose an embargo on the place you just ordered stuff from. A poll was done after he was killed, finding that 90 million Americans cried when they heard the news of his assassination. 90 million nowadays is a lot. That's about 1 in 4. But 90 million back then, in 1963, was over half of the United States. That's a lot of people crying. Lyndon B. Johnson, his entire family had the LBJ initials, with his himself being Lyndon B. Johnson, his wife being Lady Bird Johnson, and his 2 daughters, Lucy Baines Johnson and Linda Bird Johnson. Apparently, he had dogs with LBJ initials too. Richard Nixon declined going to Harvard to help his family. Nixon and Brezhnev, who is this guy right here, would go on drives together at night and talk about cars all the time. They shared so many interests, and they were supposed to be rivals. It's a very interesting fact that men can just be men sometimes, despite the political controversy going on. Gerald Ford was almost in the NFL. He was a model and was lieutenant commander in the Navy in World War II. This guy, he has a really good museum. It's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've been there. It's pretty good. Jimmy Carter, one of the nicest people on planet Earth. He was the first president born in a hospital, which is kind of wild to think about because this is like president number 39 or 40. He's the first one to be born in a hospital. One of the best people, not an insanely good president, but one of the best people in the world. He was a very good person. Ronald Reagan was the closest president to winning a unanimous election outside of George Washington. He only lost by 13 points, and his 1984 election is. George H.W. Bush enlisted in World War II the day he graduated from high school, and he was, for a time, the youngest pilot in the Navy. Obviously, there's this infamous photo of him being rescued after his plane was shot down in World War II. That is him right there. Bill Clinton memorized the full "I Have a Dream" speech after hearing it because it moved him so much. He's also famous for playing his saxophone on TV. George W. Bush owned the Texas Rangers baseball team. Barack Obama hates eating ice cream because of his first job at Baskin Robbins when he lived in Hawaii. He said he got sick of it. Donald Trump has 9 towers all over the world with his name across them. He has one in New York, one in Sunny Isles, Florida, one in Kolkata, India, one in Manila, Philippines, one in Istanbul, Turkey, one in Pune, India, one in Punta del Este, Uruguay, one in Mumbai, India, which is personally my favorite one, and one in Delhi, NCR, India, which, by the way, is not completed yet, but that's what they look like. Joe Biden overcame a childhood stutter. How interesting. Thank you guys for watching. Consider subscribing. This video took me a while gathering the facts for you guys, but thank you, and check out my other videos. Peace.